I never had a wife, the mountain man growled through his frost-covered beard, eyes as cold as the blizzard raging outside his isolated cabin. The desperate widow clutched her shivering children closer, their fate hanging on the mercy of a stranger who seemed to have none. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The freezing wind howled through the cracks of the weathered cabin, its mournful cry a familiar companion to João Silva. Hunched by the crackling fire, the middle-aged man methodically ran a whetstone along the edge of his rusty blade, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the silence he had cultivated for years. The flames cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines etched by solitude rather than age. Outside, snow piled relentlessly against his door, nature's way of reinforcing the isolation he had chosen. João hadn't spoken to another human being in so long that he sometimes wondered if his voice still worked. The mountains of Serra do Mar had become both his refuge and his prison, a place where memories couldn't find him, or so he had believed. The knife gleamed in the firelight as he tested its edge with his thumb. Sharp enough to skin a rabbit, which was all he needed these days. His calloused hands, once soft from city life, now told stories of survival, of chopping wood, hunting game, and building walls against the world. A sound broke through the howling wind, so unexpected that at first João thought he had imagined it. A knock, timid and weak, but unmistakable. He froze, the blade suspended mid-stroke. Nobody came this far up the mountain, especially not during winter's cruel grip. The knocking came again, more desperate this time, like hope making its final plea before surrendering to despair. João's heart quickened, suspicion and curiosity waging war within him. Years of isolation had taught him caution. Strangers meant danger, complications, unwanted connections. He set the knife down slowly, eyes fixed on the wooden door as if he could see through it. The knocking grew fainter with each repetition, the intervals between them lengthening. Whoever stood outside was weakening, perhaps freezing to death on his doorstep. João rose from his chair, bones aching from the cold that seeped into the marrow despite the fire's efforts. His hand hovered over the blade. Should he take it? Old instincts died hard in these mountains. The knocking had almost stopped now, reduced to what sounded like a child's feeble attempt. Something about that thought propelled him forward, feet dragging across the rough wooden floor. His hand reached for the latch, hesitated, then pulled it open just enough to peer outside. The bitter cold rushed in, carrying with it the scent of desperation and the last whisper of a knock that never landed. João Silva rose from his chair, each movement deliberate and painful. His joints protested after years of solitude in the harsh climate of Serra do Mar, where the mountain air had seeped into his bones. At 53, his body carried the weight of isolation like an invisible burden, heavier than any pack he'd hauled up these slopes. Danger lurked everywhere in these mountains. Pumas that stalked the tree line, desperate men who occasionally ventured this far seeking refuge or opportunity, and the unforgiving elements themselves. Caution wasn't just wisdom here. It was the difference between life and death. Yet something about these knocks felt different. Not the confident rapping of a threat, but something weaker, more desperate, a rhythm that spoke of last chances and fading hope. His calloused hand hesitated on the wooden latch. Years of solitude had made decisions simple. Survive, avoid others, protect what was his. This knock complicated everything. João inhaled deeply, his weathered face set in determination as he pulled the heavy door open. The wind, which had been howling like a wounded beast moments before, seemed to quiet to a whimper, as if in deference to the scene unfolding. There, illuminated by the cabin's faint glow, stood Ana Costa. Her slight frame was wrapped in a threadbare shawl, now crusted with ice crystals that glinted in the dim light. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from exposure. But it was her eyes that caught Zhao's attention. Dark pools, filled with equal parts apology and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, the word forming a small cloud in the freezing air. Behind her, two children, huddled together against the biting cold. Pedro, the boy, couldn't be more than 10 years old, yet his stance was protective as he held his younger sister close. His eyes, unlike his mother's, held suspicion and a premature hardness. The girl, Lucia, trembled visibly, her small hands clutching her brother's coat with white-knuckled intensity. Her face was partially hidden against Pedro's side, but one wide, fearful eye peered up at the mountain man. Zhao stood motionless in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the warmth escaping from inside. The family before him represented everything he'd avoided for decades: connection, responsibility, the messy complications of human need. Yet something in the boy's defiant stance, the mother's quiet dignity despite her obvious desperation, and the little girl's silent terror made his decision before his mind could fully process it. Without a word, he stepped aside, opening the door wider in silent invitation. João Silva stepped aside without a word, his weathered face betraying no emotion as the trio stumbled into the warmth of his cabin. As Ana Costa crossed the threshold, her knees finally gave way after days of desperate trekking through the snow. João caught her arm instinctively, his calloused hand steadying her with surprising gentleness. Though exhaustion had claimed every inch of her body, pride still flickered in her eyes, the stubborn dignity of a woman who'd rather collapse than ask for help. "Sit," he muttered, the first word he'd spoken to another human in months. The children stood frozen just inside the doorway, their small bodies rigid with uncertainty. João gathered an armful of thick fur pelts from his bed and tossed them beside the hearth. Pedro and Lucia collapsed onto them without hesitation, their limbs trembling uncontrollably. The boy positioned himself slightly in front of his sister, his protective instinct evident even in his exhaustion. They remained silent, watching the mountain man with wary eyes, unsure if they'd traded the danger of freezing for some new threat in this stranger's domain. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the cabin's wooden walls as João moved to a crude kitchen area. He filled a dented tin cup with water from a pot warming near the flames, his movements deliberate and practiced, though his hands remained steady, his heart hammered against his ribs, an unfamiliar rhythm after years of solitude. He offered the cup to Anna, who accepted it with trembling fingers. The widow sipped slowly, color gradually returning to her frostbitten cheeks. Pedro's wide eyes tracked João's every movement, studying the tall man with a mixture of fear and fascination. The 10-year-old's gaze darted between his mother and this gruff stranger, ready to spring into action despite his exhaustion. Little Lucia, meanwhile, had surrendered to the overwhelming relief of warmth and shelter. Her small body curled into the furs, eyelids growing heavy as the cabin's heat enveloped her. For the first time in days, the 6-year-old released a soft sigh that carried the weight of their journey. Her breathing soon settled into the gentle rhythm of sleep, her tiny hand still clutching her mother's coat. João retreated to the far corner of the cabin, giving the family space. He watched them from the shadows, this unexpected intrusion into his carefully constructed isolation. Something long dormant stirred within him as he observed the sleeping child, the vigilant boy, and the proud, desperate mother who had somehow found their way to his door. "What's your name?" João's voice cracked like the firewood in the hearth, rough from years without conversation. His words hung in the air, not threatening, but unfamiliar even to his own ears. Ana Costa hesitated, clutching the tin cup with both hands to stop their trembling. Her eyes, dark with exhaustion, met his briefly before looking down. "Ana Costa," she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured toward the children with a slight nod. "My children, Pedro and Lucia." The boy straightened his thin shoulders at the mention of his name, a flicker of pride cutting through his wariness. Despite his exhaustion, Pedro's protective stance beside his mother spoke volumes about what they'd endured. "I'm 10, he announced with unexpected confidence, "and Lucia is 6. The little girl remained curled against her mother, her small fingers wrapped around a loose thread on Anna's tattered shawl. Her eyes, wide and watchful, followed Joao's every movement. Joao nodded, acknowledging the introduction without offering his own name. Names created connections, and connections meant responsibility, something he'd avoided for decades in these mountains. He poked at the fire with a blackened iron rod, sending sparks dancing upward. The practical needs of these strangers outweighed his curiosity about their story. "You need dry clothes," he muttered, setting the rod aside. Without waiting for a response, Joao rose from his crouch, his joints protesting the movement. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he disappeared into the back room of the cabin. The space had remained largely untouched for years, a shrine to memories he rarely visited. He pulled open a wooden chest, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside lay his mother's belongings, preserved in the mountain air. His calloused hands, more accustomed to gripping tools and weapons, carefully lifted out a faded dress. It was simple but sturdy, practical like the woman who had once worn it. Beside it, he found one of his old woolen shirts, smaller than what he wore now, but large enough for the boy. When Joao returned to the main room, Anna was whispering something to Pedro, their heads bent close together. They fell silent at his approach. He extended the garments without ceremony, offering them with a quiet nod. "Warm up first," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We'll talk later." The widow accepted the clothes with trembling hands, gratitude and uncertainty battling in her expression. For the first time since opening his door, Joao allowed himself to wonder what force of desperation had driven this family to his isolated doorstep, and what trouble might have followed them. He stepped outside, letting the frigid air bite his lungs as he stared at the tree line. The Serra do Mar mountains loomed dark against the night sky, silent witnesses to his solitude. Joao Silva inhaled deeply. Feeling the cold burn down his throat, a familiar pain that kept him anchored to reality. Memories flooded back unbidden, his father's weathered hands guiding his own as they laid each log of the cabin, the old man's laughter echoing through the forest as they worked. Then later, digging frozen earth to lay him to rest, when pneumonia finally took what strength remained. 23 winters had passed since then, each day marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, each season bleeding into the next in perfect, empty silence. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying snowflakes that melted against his beard. The mountain man gazed at his calloused palms, remembering how they once trembled when he nailed the last board in place, completing the home his father would never see finished. Now these same hands had opened the door to strangers, breaking the vow of isolation he'd maintained for decades. Inside, Anna settled by the crackling fire, her cheeks flushed with warmth at last. The flames cast dancing shadows across her exhausted face, highlighting the quiet dignity she maintained despite their desperate circumstances. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair, eyes fixed on the flames, as if they might reveal what tomorrow would bring. The widow's shoulders gradually relaxed, the immediate danger of freezing to death now replaced by uncertainty about their mysterious host. Pedro sat cross-legged nearby, his thin frame tense and vigilant. The 10-year-old's eyes darted between the door and his mother, a mixture of fear and admiration evident in his expression. His small hands remained balled into fists, ready to defend his family if needed, a child forced to shoulder a man's responsibility far too soon. He studied the wooden carvings on the mantelpiece, curious yet wary of touching anything in this stranger's domain. Little Lucia curled closer to her mother, her 6-year-old body still trembling occasionally despite the warmth. Unlike her brother, she made no pretense of bravery, seeking comfort in the familiar embrace rather than trusting the safety offered by the bearded mountain man. Her eyelids grew heavy as the heat from the hearth seeped into her bones, but she fought sleep, tiny fingers clutching her mother's worn shawl, as if it might protect them both from whatever dangers lurked in this unfamiliar shelter. The silence hung between them like a physical presence, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire. João Silva finally cleared his throat, his voice emerging rough from disuse. "What brought you here?" he asked, eyes fixed on the flames rather than his unexpected guests. "Nobody comes to these mountains unless they're running from something." Ana Costa's hands trembled in her lap as she gathered her courage. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of months of suffering. "My husband died last spring," she began, each word tinged with grief and shame. "A fever took him in 3 days. I tried to save him with herbs, but," she trailed off, swallowing hard. "The drought came after. Our crops withered in the fields. Nothing would grow." Pedro shifted closer to his mother, his young face hardened by experiences no child should endure. Lucia remained curled against Anna's side, her eyelids heavy but fighting sleep to watch the strange man who'd given them shelter. "I went to every farm in the valley," Anna continued, "but no one would hire a widow with 2 children. They said I'd be too slow, too distracted." Her voice hardened. "Some offered help with conditions I couldn't accept." João nodded once, understanding without needing details. "Then winter came early," she said, gesturing toward the howling wind outside. "Last week, the snow collapsed our roof. We huddled in the corner that remained standing. But the cold," she shuddered at the memory. "We've been walking since Monday. 5 days through the snow. I heard stories of a cabin up here. I didn't know if anyone lived here anymore. But we had nowhere else to go." The mountain man rose silently and moved to a pot hanging near the fire. He ladled thick rabbit stew into 3 wooden bowls, the rich aroma filling the small cabin with the promise of life continuing. "Eat," he said simply, handing the first bowl to Anna. Pedro watched suspiciously as his mother accepted the food, but his resolve crumbled at the smell. When João offered him a bowl, the boy took it with a quick nod that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," Anna whispered, helping Lucia hold her spoon steady. "We won't stay long, just until the storm passes." João returned to his chair, watching them eat with methodical care, savoring each bite as only the truly hungry can. He said nothing about how long they could stay, but something in his posture had softened, the rigid line of his shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly. The stew disappeared quickly, the simple meal a salvation more profound than any feast. Pedro stared at the steaming bowl, his small hands hovering uncertainly above it. His eyes flickered to Ana Costa, seeking permission as he'd been taught. Only when she gave a slight nod did the 10-year-old finally lift the spoon to his lips. Each mouthful was measured, deliberate, not the ravenous consumption one might expect from a child who had trudged through snow for 5 days. Instead, his careful eating revealed a deeper truth. The boy understood how narrowly they'd escaped death's cold grip. Across from him, little Lucia ate with less restraint, her tiny fingers occasionally abandoning the spoon to scoop bits of meat directly. Anna watched her children with weary relief washing over her face. When the bowls were empty, she gathered them with practiced efficiency, stacking them neatly despite her trembling hands. The simple domestic act seemed to ground her, a fragment of normalcy in their upended world. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "We haven't eaten properly since Tuesday." João Silva remained silent, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. The mountain man's calloused fingers absently traced the grain of the wooden table, hands that had built this cabin, buried his father, and survived decades alone in the unforgiving Serra de Mar. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken histories. Finally, he looked up, something vulnerable crossing his features. It was a look that seemed foreign to his face, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Nunca tive esposa, he murmured in Portuguese, his mother tongue emerging in this rare moment of openness. Nunca achei que serviria para isso. I never had a wife. Never thought I'd be suited for it. The confession hung in the air, unexpected and raw. Anna didn't respond with words. What could she say to this stranger whose solitude had been interrupted by their desperate arrival? Instead, she simply nodded, understanding passing between them. Sometimes survival meant accepting kindness from unexpected sources, and sometimes offering shelter meant exposing long-buried vulnerabilities. Pedro watched this exchange with curious eyes, sensing something important passing between the adults. He edged closer to his mother, protective despite his exhaustion. "We won't be trouble," the boy promised suddenly, his young voice steady with determination. "I can help with chores, I'm strong." Joao's gaze shifted to the child, something like respect flickering in his eyes. He gave a single nod, acknowledgement of the boy's dignity and offer, before turning back to tend the fire that kept the mountain cold at bay for one more night. Joao Silva insisted they take his bed, waving off Anna's protests with a gruff gesture that brooked no argument. The weathered mountaineer had spent countless nights in worse conditions than his sturdy chair by the fire. The widow's exhausted eyes betrayed her gratitude, despite her hesitation. "Please, you've already done too much," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Her shoulders slumped with the weight of pride fighting against necessity. "The bed is big enough for all three of you," Joao replied, his voice rusty from years of silence. "The children need proper rest." He gestured toward the back room with calloused hands that hadn't known gentleness in decades. Anna nodded, finally, gathering Pedro and Lucia close. The boy stood tall beside his mother, still watchful of their host, but no longer fearful. Little Lucia clutched her mother's borrowed dress, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion, yet fighting sleep as children often do when surrounded by the unfamiliar. "Come, children," Anna murmured, guiding them toward the bedroom. Pedro glanced back at Joao, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The beginning of something like trust. The trio disappeared into the darkness of the back room, their footsteps light on the wooden floor. The soft click of the door closing echoed through the cabin, a sound that seemed to mark more than just their retirement for the night. It was the sound of Joao's solitude being interrupted, perhaps permanently. Alone again, the former hermit settled into his chair, its familiar creaks a poor substitute for conversation. The firelight cast dancing shadows across the walls of his home, now transformed by the presence of strangers. He stared into the glowing embers, mesmerized by their dying light. Sleep refused to come. Joan's mind raced with thoughts long buried beneath years of isolation. The desperate knock still echoed in his ears, that hesitant, pleading sound that had somehow penetrated walls, built not just of timber, but of grief and deliberate solitude. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, remembering how the little girl had looked at the wooden fox carving on his shelf with such wonder. How long had it been since anyone had admired his handiwork? The boy's protective stance reminded him of himself at that age, standing guard over what little family remained. And Anna, her quiet dignity in the face of desperation, stirred something he thought long dead, not desire, but something more fundamental, the human need for connection, for purpose beyond mere survival. Joao added another log to the fire, watching as it caught and blazed anew. Something was awakening inside him, something dormant for so long he'd forgotten its existence, a need to care, to protect, to not be alone in this vast wilderness that had been both his refuge and his prison. Just as dawn threatened to break, a distant sound shattered the fragile peace. Hoofbeats crunching through the snow, slow and deliberate. João Silva's body tensed, years of isolation having sharpened his senses to any disturbance in his mountain sanctuary. The crackling fire cast long shadows as he moved silently to the frosted window, his breath creating small clouds against the glass. Through the crystallized pane, he caught sight of two strangers approaching on horseback. Their mounts were too well fed for such a harsh season, muscles rippling beneath glossy coats despite the bitter cold. João's eyes narrowed. In these mountains, only those with resources or dangerous intentions maintained animals in such condition during winter. The riders moved with a confidence that troubled him. Not the cautious approach of lost travelers, but the deliberate advance of men who knew exactly where they were headed. Their silhouettes grew larger against the pristine white landscape, dark figures cutting through the pale morning light. João's calloused hand reached for his old hunting rifle, the wood smooth from years of use. The weight felt familiar as he held it across his chest, a companion that had kept him alive through countless winters. He glanced toward the back room, where Anna and her children slept, their soft breathing the only sound besides the occasional pop from the dying embers. The strangers dismounted about 20 paces from the cabin, their boots sinking deep into the snow. One was tall and lean, the other shorter but broader across the shoulders. Both moved with the arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. João recognized the posture, the slight forward lean, hands never far from their waists, where weapons would be concealed. He positioned himself in the shadows, away from the window, but with clear sight of the approaching threat. The rifle felt warm against his chest, a stark contrast to the chill that ran down his spine. These men hadn't stumbled upon his cabin by accident. They were hunting. For a moment, João considered waking Anna, but decided against it. Better to let her and the children rest while he assessed the danger. If these men were connected to her past, as his instincts suggested, they would need all their strength for what might come. The taller man gestured toward the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, saying something to his companion that João couldn't hear. Both laughed, a sound that carried across the snow with chilling clarity. João tightened his grip on the rifle, his thumb resting near the hammer, ready. "Nice cabin you got here, friend," the first man called out, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Seems cozy on such a cold night." João Silva remained motionless in the shadows, his weathered face illuminated only by slivers of moonlight filtering through the frost-covered windows. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. Years of isolation had taught him that men who approached in the dead of night rarely brought good intentions. The second man let out a laugh that echoed across the snowy clearing, a hollow sound devoid of any real humor. The noise sent a chill through the cabin that had nothing to do with the winter air. "We're just looking for some company on this freezing night," the first man continued, his boots crunching in the snow as he moved closer to the door. "Surely you can spare a moment for weary travelers." João's fingers tightened around his rifle, the wood smooth and familiar against his calloused palms. These men moved with too much confidence for simple travelers. Their horses looked well-fed and strong, unusual for the harsh winter conditions that had claimed so many animals in the Serra do Mar. "I prefer my solitude," João finally responded, his voice rough from disuse. "Move on." The friendly pretense dropped instantly. "Open the door," the second man demanded, his tone now sharp as the mountain wind. "We know someone passed through here." The mountain man shifted his position, allowing the moonlight to catch the barrel of his rifle, a silent warning that needed no translation. The message was clear. This cabin would not welcome them. "We're looking for a woman," the first man said, his voice lower now. Traveling with 2 children. They would have come this way. Joao's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized why Ana Costa had looked so haunted, why little Lucia clung so desperately to her mother, why Pedro's eyes held such wariness. They weren't just fleeing poverty. They were running from these men. "Nobody's passed through here," he replied steadily, the lie coming easily to protect those huddled in his back room. "I haven't seen anyone in months." The tension thickened between them, hanging heavy as the clouds promising more snow. Joao could feel the men measuring him, calculating whether he was worth the trouble. His finger rested near the trigger, ready but patient. "You sure about that?" the second man pressed, his hand hovering near his waist where a weapon surely waited. "It would be a shame if we found out you were lying." Joao stood his ground, unmoving. These men expected compliance or fear. They would receive neither from him. Joao Silva's heart hammered against his ribs as the pieces fell into place. These men weren't random travelers seeking shelter. They were hunting Ana and her children specifically. The realization chilled him more than the mountain air ever could. "Nobody's passed through here," he stated firmly in Portuguese, his voice carrying the weight of decades of solitude. "Ninguém passou por aqui." The lie came easily, born not from deceit, but from a sudden, fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. The taller stranger leaned forward in his saddle, moonlight catching on a gold tooth as he smiled. "You sure about that, old man? A woman, 2 little ones? They couldn't have gone far in this weather." His words dripped with false concern, oily and dangerous. "I've been alone for 15 years, Joao replied, tightening his grip on the rifle. "And I prefer it that way." The second man spat into the snow. "Check his tracks," he muttered to his companion. "No one lives this isolated without going crazy." Joao remained motionless in the doorway, the weapon steady in his weathered hands. He could feel Ana and the children listening from the back room, their fear a tangible presence in the cabin. "Look," the gold-toothed man said, spreading his hands in mock surrender. "We're not looking for trouble. The woman owes a debt. Her husband died owing money to important people. We're just here to collect what's ours." Joao's jaw tightened. "There's nothing here for you." After a tense standoff that seemed to stretch into eternity, the men finally retreated, their horses' hooves crunching through the icy crust of snow. "We'll be back," the leader called over his shoulder. "And next time, we won't be asking so nicely." Joao watched until they disappeared into the darkness, the rifle still clutched tight against his chest. Only when the last echo of hoofbeats faded did he close and bar the door, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite the tremor in his hands. Inside the cabin, Ana Costa emerged from the shadows, Pedro and Lucia clinging to her like frightened birds. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror and guilt. "They found us," she whispered, pulling her children closer. "I'm so sorry. We should leave." Joao shook his head once, decisively. "No." Ana's gaze met his, understanding passing between them without words. The storm howling outside was nothing compared to the one approaching on horseback. But for the first time in years, neither of them would face it alone. "They'll be back with more men," she said softly. Joao nodded, already mentally cataloging his weapons, supplies, and the cabin's defensive weaknesses. "Then we'll be ready." The next day arrived with a pale sun that did nothing to warm the unease hanging in the cabin. Ana Costa sat at the worn wooden table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood as she finally revealed the truth that had driven her family into the wilderness. "My husband owed money to powerful men," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the fever took him last spring, they came to collect." Her eyes darted to Lucia, who was playing quietly in the corner with a small wooden fox she'd found among Joao's carvings. "They said my daughter would make a suitable payment." Joao's hand tightened around his coffee cup, knuckles whitening. The protective instinct that surged through him felt almost foreign, a fire he hadn't felt burning since his youth, when his father still lived and taught him the meaning of family. "They won't touch her," he said simply, the gravel in his voice smoothed by determination. That afternoon, Joao began reinforcing the cabin's defenses. He nailed wooden slats across vulnerable windows, creating narrow shooting gaps. Pedro followed him like a shadow, eager to help, his young face serious with newfound purpose. "Like this?" the boy asked, holding a nail steady while Joao hammered. "Exactly like that," the mountain man nodded, surprised by the warmth that spread through his chest at the child's earnest assistance. In the yard behind the cabin, Joao set up empty bottles on a fallen log. Ana stood nervously, a revolver looking oversized in her delicate hands. "It will kick," he warned, positioning himself behind her. "Breathe out when you squeeze the trigger." The widow's first shot went wild, but by the fifth attempt, she'd shattered 2 bottles. A grim smile of satisfaction crossed her face. This was a woman who would protect her children at any cost. Inside, Joao showed Pedro how to pack gunpowder, the boy's nimble fingers quickly mastering the task. "Not too tight," he instructed. "Just enough." As evening approached, Lucia helped her mother prepare a simple meal, while Joao and Pedro finished securing the back door. Each task, each lesson, was another brick in the fragile wall of safety they were building together. That night, as the children slept, Ana approached Joao by the fire. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. Joao stared into the flames, considering his answer carefully. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," he finally replied. Ana nodded, understanding the weight of unspoken history in his words. She reached out, her fingers briefly touching his weathered hand, a silent pact between 2 survivors now bound by common enemies and shared purpose. As winter's grip tightened, the cabin gradually transformed from a hermit's refuge into something resembling a home. Pedro Costa, his small hands reddened by cold, learned to chop kindling under Joao's watchful eye. The boy's determination showed in every swing of the axe, his face screwed up in concentration as he mimicked the older man's technique. "Like this?" he would ask, and Joao would nod, offering rare words of praise that made the child stand taller. Meanwhile, Lucia discovered the shelf where Joao kept his wooden carvings, dozens of small animals, each whittled during lonely winter nights over the years. Her eyes widened at the collection, fingers hovering reverently, before settling on a small fox with alert ears and a bushy tail. "Can I hold it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joao nodded, watching as the 6-year-old cradled the carving like it contained magic. "You keep it," he said gruffly, turning away before she could see the softness in his eyes. The little girl clutched the wooden fox to her chest, her first possession since fleeing their home. In the main room, Ana swelled floors that hadn't seen a broom in years, humming softly as dust motes danced in the afternoon light. She found an old needle and thread in a drawer and began mending Zhuang's worn shirts, her fingers working with practiced precision. Each stitch seemed to repair something within her as well, scrubbing away memories of fear and hunger that had haunted her since her husband's death. By evening, the cabin smelled of pine and stew instead of loneliness. Ana had scrubbed every surface, arranged the meager furniture to accommodate 4 instead of 1, and hung the children's damp clothes near the fire. The transformation was more than physical. Laughter echoed where silence had reigned for decades. After the children fell asleep, Joao sat at the rough-hewn table, methodically cleaning his rifle. The metal gleamed in the firelight as his calloused hands worked with practiced efficiency. He checked his revolvers next, loading each chamber with careful precision. Ana watched him from across the room, understanding without words. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear beneath. Joao nodded, not looking up from his weapons. "They always do." His hands never faltered as he prepared for what both knew was inevitable. Another visit, likely with more men, more guns, and less mercy. The cabin had transformed from a place of isolation to one of protection. But Joao knew the price of that transformation might soon be paid in blood. Their fears proved justified as the night deepened. Flickering lanterns appeared between the trees, dancing like malevolent fireflies through the darkness. Joao Silva moved silently to the window, his weathered face hardening at the sight of shadows circling the cabin. The crunch of boots in snow grew louder, more deliberate, as if the intruders no longer cared about stealth. "They're here," he whispered, turning to Anna. Her face paled, but she straightened her shoulders. Joao reached for his rifle, and after a moment's hesitation, handed Anna his old revolver. Her hands trembled as she took it, but her eyes remained steady, filled with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her children. "I've never shot anyone," she admitted quietly. "Pray you won't have to," Joao replied, checking his ammunition. "But if they get past me—" Pedro stood in the doorway, little Lucia clutching his hand. The boy's face was a mask of fear and courage, so much like his mother's. Joao knelt before him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Take your sister to the cellar," he instructed, his voice low but clear. "Remember how I showed you? Under the rug in the back room." Pedro nodded, his chin lifting slightly. "I'll protect her." Joao moved to the center of the room, pulling back the worn rug to reveal a trap door. The hidden cellar had been his father's idea, built during times when bandits roamed these mountains freely. He'd never imagined it would shelter a family. "Quickly now," he urged, as Pedro guided Lucia down the narrow steps. The little girl clutched her wooden fox talisman tightly, the carving Joao had made years ago now her most precious possession. Anna hesitated at the entrance, looking back at Joao. In the dim light, their eyes met with an understanding that transcended words. These few weeks together had forged something neither had expected: trust, perhaps even something deeper. "You'll let me know?" she whispered, the revolver steady in her hand now. "When it's safe, eu aviso," Joao promised in Portuguese, the language of his heart slipping out in this moment of truth. "I'll let you know." As Anna descended, Joao sealed the trapdoor and replaced the rug, erasing all evidence of their hiding place. Outside, the attackers had completed their circle around the cabin. He could hear them communicating in low voices, planning their assault. Joao positioned himself by the window, rifle at the ready, his heart pounding with every beat. For the first time in decades, he wasn't fighting just for himself. The weight of 3 other lives pressed against his conscience, making his hands steadier, his resolve stronger than ever before. The siege was about to begin. The attackers approached the cabin with deliberate steps, their boots crunching in the snow. A sharp knock rattled the door, followed by a voice that sliced through the night like a blade. "We know they're in there, Silva," the leader called, his tone mockingly polite. "The woman and her children owe a debt. We're just here to collect what's rightfully ours." Joao Silva stood behind the door, his weathered hand resting on the old rifle. Years of mountain solitude had taught him to read men's intentions, and these men reeked of malice. "There are no debts to be paid here," he replied, voice steady through the narrow crack in the door. "Leave my property now." The leader's laugh echoed across the clearing. Her husband borrowed money he couldn't repay. The agreement was clear. His voice dropped to something uglier. "The little girl will fetch a good price. Pretty little thing like that." Joao's knuckles whitened around the rifle. The true nature of their pursuit was now clear. They viewed Lucia as merchandise, not a child. The thought of the timid 6-year-old, who had found comfort in his wooden fox carving, being taken by these men ignited something primal within him. "You won't take her," Joao stated simply, as if commenting on the weather. The first bullet splintered the doorframe, inches from his face. Joao ducked as glass shattered and wood splintered around him. The cabin, once his fortress against loneliness, was now a literal fortress under siege. He moved with practiced efficiency, years of solitary hunting serving him well. From the window, he spotted a man circling toward the back. João aimed carefully and fired. The attacker fell with a cry, clutching his leg. Bullets peppered the front wall as João crawled to another position. He spotted a second man trying to reach the wounded one and took his shot. The bullet found its mark in the man's shoulder, sending him scrambling for cover. A third attacker charged the door, but João was ready. The rifle cracked again, and the man retreated, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with gunpowder and tension. João reloaded methodically, his breaths measured and controlled. The years spent alone on this mountain had hardened him, prepared him for this moment without him knowing it. As the gunfire momentarily ceased, João felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Not just determination or rage, but something warmer. For the first time in decades, he was fighting for something beyond himself, for someone else, for a family. The realization settled in him like an ember, small but persistent. It felt strangely like hope. In the darkness of the hidden cellar, Ana Costa clutched Lucia to her chest, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her own. The 6-year-old buried her face in her mother's worn blouse, clutching the small wooden fox figure she refused to leave behind. Pedro sat beside them, his young face hardened with premature courage as gunshots echoed overhead. "He'll protect us, mine," Pedro whispered, his voice steadier than his trembling hands. "Senhor João é forte." The boy's eyes darted to the ceiling, where dust fell with each impact, his faith in their reluctant protector unwavering despite the chaos. Ana stroked her son's hair, silently praying he was right. The cellar smelled of earth and potatoes, the single lantern casting long shadows across their faces. She had gambled everything on a stranger's mercy, and now that same man was fighting for their lives. Above them, João Silva moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived alone for years. The cabin filled with acrid smoke as he fired through different windows, creating the illusion of multiple defenders. His ears rang with each shot, but his hands remained steady. He had forgotten how it felt to fight for something beyond himself. A bullet splintered the doorframe, inches from his head. João ducked, reloaded, and waited. The attackers were growing desperate, their shots more erratic. He had wounded at least 2 of them, judging by the cries of pain that punctuated the gunfire. Then, unexpectedly, a gruff voice called out from behind the tree line. "Silva, enough bloodshed." João froze, recognizing the voice immediately. Antonio Rocha, older now, but unmistakable. The man who had fought alongside his father decades ago, before choosing different paths. "What do you want, Rocha?" João called back, rifle still aimed at the shadows. The older man stepped partially into view, keeping his weapon lowered. "I want no part in harming women or children. These men didn't tell me that's what we were after." A tense silence followed, as other attackers muttered in disagreement. Antonio silenced them with a sharp gesture before continuing. "I'm offering you a deal, out of respect for your father," the grizzled elder said, his weathered face visible in the moonlight. "Keep Ana and her children safe here. We'll leave tonight. But understand this, if she runs again, worse men will come. Men I can't control." João considered the offer, calculating the odds. The cellar door beneath his feet concealed 3 vulnerable lives now entrusted to him. He had lived alone for years, but tonight solitude was no longer an option. "Your word on it?" João demanded. "My word," Antonio replied solemnly, "but only if you give yours in return." João nodded, sealing a pact that would forever change the course of 4 intertwined lives. João's words settled between them like an ancient pact. "I accept your terms," he told Antonio Rocha, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. The old man nodded, a flash of respect crossing his weathered face before he signaled his remaining men to retreat. 2 wounded attackers lay moaning in the snow. João Silva dragged them one by one to the edge of the forest, far enough that wolves wouldn't find them before their companions returned. He bandaged their wounds with strips torn from his own shirt, not from kindness, but from a code older than the mountains themselves. "Tell your friends what happened here," he muttered, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Tell them what happens to men who threaten children." When João returned to the cabin, his hands were stained with blood, not his own. Ana rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as relief washed over her. Pedro broke from his mother's side and flung his arms around João's waist, burying his face against the rough fabric of his shirt. For a heartbeat, João stood frozen, unused to human touch after years of solitude. Then, slowly, his arms encircled the boy's shoulders in an awkward but genuine embrace. "You saved us," Pedro whispered, looking up with eyes that held both gratitude and something João hadn't seen in decades: trust. "We saved each other," João answered, his voice rough with emotion. He looked over the boy's head to where Ana stood with Lucia clinging to her skirt. Something unspoken passed between the adults, a recognition that their lives had become irrevocably intertwined. They barricaded the broken window with boards and hung blankets to keep the cold at bay. No one slept much that night. João kept watch by the fire, rifle across his knees, while Ana dozed fitfully in the chair opposite, startling at every creak of the cabin's timbers. The children finally succumbed to exhaustion on a pile of furs near the hearth, Lucia clutching the wooden fox carving like a talisman. By morning, a strange calm had settled over them. The immediate danger had passed, but João knew better than to believe it was over. Men like those who had come would return, or others like them. Survival alone wouldn't be enough. "We need to make this place truly ours," he said as he poured steaming tea into tin cups. "Not just a shelter, but a home." Ana nodded, understanding flowing between them. "A place to belong," she added softly. João looked around at the cabin that had been his prison of solitude for so long. Now, with these 3 souls under his roof, it felt different, like the beginning of something he'd never dared to imagine. As spring crept into the mountains, the snow began to melt, revealing patches of vibrant green beneath. João Silva and Pedro worked side by side, hammering wooden planks into place for the cabin extension. The 10-year-old boy had proven himself a quick learner, his small hands growing more confident with each nail he drove into the timber. "Like this?" Pedro asked, holding up a plank for inspection. João nodded, a hint of pride warming his weathered face. "Perfect. You have good hands for building." While they worked, Ana Costa tended to her newly planted kitchen garden. Her fingers, once soft from household work, had grown calloused from months in the mountains, but she moved with purpose as she pressed seeds into the dark soil. The garden would provide vegetables throughout the summer, potatoes, beans, and herbs that would flavor their meals and sustain them through the next winter. Little Lucia danced around the yard, gathering wildflowers that had begun to peek through the last patches of snow. Her voice carried across the clearing as she named each blossom. "This yellow one is Carajum," she announced, placing it carefully in a circle around the cabin. "And this blue one is Esperanza." The cabin that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with life. Mornings began with the clatter of breakfast preparations, afternoons filled with the rhythmic sounds of chopping wood and washing clothes, and evenings ended with stories shared around the fire. The silence that had been João's only companion for years had transformed into something beautiful, a symphony of family life that he never knew he craved. In the evenings, when the children were asleep, João would sit by the fire, carving wood with his weathered knife. His latest creation took shape slowly, a woman standing tall with 2 children at her side. His fingers, accustomed to crafting solitary animals, now formed the gentle curves of a family. What João didn't know was that Ana often watched him work from the shadows. When he set the carving down to rest, she would approach it silently, her fingertips tracing the wooden figures with reverence. Tears would glisten in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a gratitude so profound it could only be expressed in silence. One night, as she touched the wooden family, a tear fell onto the carving. She quickly wiped it away, but not before João had seen it from across the room. Their eyes met, and for the first time since her arrival, they shared a smile that needed no words. The morning's tranquility shattered when Pedro spotted a dark column of smoke rising beyond the eastern ridge. João Silva climbed to the cabin's roof, his weathered face hardening as he peered through his father's old binoculars. There, in the clearing below, a dozen men in matching Navy uniforms had established a camp, their vehicles bearing the insignia of Novo Horizonte Development Corporation. "They're not just passing through," he told Ana as he descended. "They're surveying the land." Ana Costa's fingers tightened around the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir breakfast. "For what purpose?" she asked, though the dread in her voice suggested she already knew. "Progress," João spat the word like venom. "Rich men from the city calling our mountains resources instead of home." That night, after the children were asleep, João slipped away to scout the camp. Crouched behind a fallen log, he watched the men unfurl maps across folding tables, their fingers tracing lines that cut through homes and hunting grounds alike. He recognized this pattern: corporate enforcers laying groundwork for evictions, for legal theft of land families had lived on for generations. "We need more than rifles this time," he whispered to Ana upon his return, his voice grave in the cabin's darkness. "We need the law." The following dawn, João prepared for the journey to the city. He hadn't left his mountain in years, but now survival demanded it. He packed light, some dried meat, a canteen, and a faded photograph of himself and Paulo Oliveira, a boyhood friend who'd become a judge with influence in regional courts. 3 days, he promised Ana, his hand briefly touching hers. "Keep the rifle loaded." After João disappeared down the winding trail, Ana gathered Pedro and Lucia by the hearth. "Your lessons will be different while Señor João is away," she explained, showing them how to extinguish lights at the first sound of approaching vehicles, how to move silently to the hidden cellar, how to signal danger using the mirrors João had positioned around the property. "Why can't we just tell them to go away?" Lucia asked, clutching the wooden fox talisman she never set down. "Because some men only understand power," Ana replied, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. "And until João returns with help, we must be invisible." Each night, the three huddled together in João's bed, Pedro insisting on taking the side nearest the door. Every distant sound, a branch breaking, an animal call, the wind shifting direction, jolted them awake, hearts pounding with the terrible knowledge that in these mountains, danger was patient and safety was never guaranteed. João Silva returned to find his cabin door ajar, a terrible silence hanging in the air. Inside, 3 armed men surrounded Ana Costa and the children, their weapons pointed at the terrified family. Without hesitation, João slipped through the hidden cellar entrance he'd built beneath the floorboards. The first intruder never saw him coming. João fired with the precision of a man who'd survived decades in the wilderness. The second man whirled around, but Ana had already grabbed the revolver, hidden beneath a stack of blankets. Her hands no longer trembled as she pulled the trigger, her maternal instinct transforming fear into fierce protection. "Get down!" João shouted to Pedro, who pulled his sister to the floor. The boy covered Lucia's small body with his own as gunfire echoed through the cabin. The last intruder fled, blood streaming from his shoulder. João chased him to the tree line, making sure he wouldn't return, while Ana gathered the children in her arms, whispering reassurances against their hair. "You came back," Ana said when João returned, her voice steady despite everything. "I promised I would," he answered simply, checking Pedro and Lucia for injuries. The children clung to him, no longer afraid of the once solitary mountain man. That night, as the family huddled close to the fire, João shared news from his journey. His old friend Paulo Oliveira had granted them legal protection for the land. The judge had been moved by João's transformation from hermit to protector, and promised to keep the corporate land grabbers at bay. As spring melted into summer, word spread through the mountains about the sanctuary at Silva's Hollow. First came a young mother with an infant, fleeing an abusive husband. Then an elderly couple whose farm had been seized by debt collectors. João built simple cabins, teaching the men to hunt, while Ana showed the women how to cultivate the rocky mountain soil. By autumn, 7 families had joined them. The sound of children playing replaced the lonely howl of wind through the trees. A small school took shape beside the garden, where Lucia's wildflowers now bloomed in colorful profusion. One evening, as the community gathered for a shared meal, João found himself watching Ana as she served stew to their neighbors. Her eyes caught his, a smile spreading across her face, not the desperate plea of that first night, but something warm and certain. Later, as they sat on the porch of the expanded cabin, Pedro and Lucia asleep inside, João took Ana's hand in his calloused one. "I never thought I would have this," he confessed. "A family?" Ana asked. "A reason," João replied, his gaze sweeping over the little settlement that had grown from desperation and courage. In the distance, lanterns glowed in each cabin window like stars brought down to earth, each one a testament to the fierce love that had forged their unlikely family.